But yeah, it is all relative to where you're at the moment. And then how much time you're going to give it to kind of normalize in a lot of these things, especially I think with endurance running or anything that takes months and years to really kind of get to a point where the development has time to occur to the point where you're hitting personal bests and getting close to your full potential. You're just going to have to be patient and kind of take your growth like one step at a time versus trying to be at the finish line, right when you get started.
All right, man, let's kick off. Zach, I'm very, very happy to be doing this, not just from, let's say, the running aspect, because I suppose the running is obviously, it's great. It's an amazing, you've done the feats you've done, but I think you speak really well about like nutrition side of things, psychology side of things, and like helping other people also do it. And that's been a huge part of your work as well, with the coaching you do. So it's going to be awesome to get into some of those details, man. It's going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah. Thanks for having me on.
I appreciate it, man. So as always, I want to start with, why is it you do what you do?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think like it's a question I ask all my onboarding clients for the most part is like, what's your purpose? Sort of is a type of a question that I think is important just so you understand, like, why are you waking up in the morning and spending, a couple hours of your day preparing for something that's maybe 4 or 6 months down the road and wanting to do that. So, I think my why has shifted or at least like evolved from when I first started running to today. So like when I first got into it, it was just like, I'm better at this than I am at other sports. So there's that draw from the competition side of things. That certainly continued and still fuels me today. When I was in college, I started kind of gravitating towards just the methodologies around like why you do certain workouts and things like that. It was just an opportunity I had to kind of learn a lot more. And I was exposed to a lot more of the information that I had been previously. And then it was kind of about just figuring out what parts of running I enjoy the most. And one thing that kind of stuck out to me fairly early on was like, I really like the long run, the higher volume, lower intensity stuff. I don't mind speed work. I like it too, but it's not something that I'm going to structure my, I'm going to look at that a little bit more as like a means to an end in a lot of cases than I am the other stuff. And now it's just kind of like figuring out where my limitations are. I think it's, I've had the opportunity to test myself on fairly controllable courses where weather's pretty consistent, environment's pretty consistent. And, one of the reasons I like those type of setups is, despite the monotony you get on a 400-meter track and running all day on that, you also can really compare your effort from one year to the next. And one of my big drives is just to try to see like, well, where is that spot where like I can't go faster than this? So I think as long as that's on the table, that's always going to be a big driver for me. And kind of something that sort of comes along with the ride with that is just you can get kind of like micro doses of that throughout your training too, where you go through like a cycle of training where you're focusing on like short intervals or long intervals or your long run development. You can kind of like watch that progress and see where you're hitting like previous benchmarks or exceeding those and making adjustments. I really do like the kind of like the planning and the execution of the kind of smaller detailed stuff as well. So keeps my mind and body busy enough to call it a day, I guess.
Yeah, definitely, man. It's funny because like a lot of the high performers that I speak to, like, they obviously wake up and they do, 3 to 4 hours, let's say, on the road or in the pool or on the bike or in the gym, whatever. But then they spend the other time like in fucking spreadsheets and they're analyzing their performance and looking at that stuff. So I think there's like the devil's in the detail with that stuff, and they're analyzing all those metrics. We can get into all those metrics in a while as well in terms of like what you measure. But do you think that like, you naturally gravitated towards this? You got into this quite young, let's say the ultra, where you were around 26, you moved from marathon to ultra in that kind of an earlier stage than maybe usual some people?
Yeah, I think nowadays it probably doesn't look as odd. I mean, we just had, I was 24 when I ran my first 50 miler in 2010. This year, the winner of the Western States 100, Adam Peterman, is like, I think he's like 26. So like we're getting to a point where that's not uncommon anymore. But yeah, when I first got into the sport, it was sort of transitioning away from this mindset of, oh, you just go through like you exhaust yourself at the Olympic distance stuff. And then like, if you still have something left to give, then maybe you step up into ultra marathons or step into them, I guess you'd say. And I think you'll probably see a little bit more of that from kind of the tip of the spear from the Olympic distance athletes in the future, as like they see a way to extend their career perhaps by going longer than the marathon. But you're also going to see people who are maybe just a little bit more tired of kind of the ins and outs of the structured training that you're going to get a lot of the collegiate programs, some of the post collegiate professional programs and things like that, and just fall in love with being able to go out and run in the trails and kind of structure the training around that. And I think that's probably one of the reasons we've seen the trail side of the sport grow so much in the last decade, is it offers enough of a different experience that someone who is maybe, tired or fatigued from the standard stuff are able to kind of still do the activity they once fell in love with without the kind of pain and misery that they learned to deal with over the years.
Yeah, isn't that really actually a fascinating kind of idea, because you got into running because you just enjoyed running. You had that kind of runner's high. You were getting good release from it, and you went on to become more like analytical from it. There's actually a YouTuber called Ali Abdal, who a big productivity guy, and he kind of always says that if you do anything long enough, it kind of just becomes a job.
Yeah.
And it takes away from, let's say, the novel aspect of it. Even podcasting, I have a podcast agency, I have a podcast business, and it's all built around it. But I still I'm passionate about like recording. But I think for you, do you also, enjoy that analytical side versus, let's say, some of the freestyle Goggins of just get up and just fucking go for it every day, What kind of side do you kind of favor towards?
Yeah, I like the analytical side a lot. I definitely lean into it. I really do look like when I'm analyzing like progress. Usually, if I'm training for a 100-mile anyway, usually I'm focusing kind of on developing or really watching one intensity or specific intensity that I'm kind of working towards developing for around like a 4 to 6 week like time frame. So like watching like kind of where is my volume at intensity for that particular target, and then what is my pace as well, if I can control things like weather and do on similar course and things like that. Well, I really like using those and using those to kind of gauge where I'm heading in the right direction, or whether I need to kind of step back a little bit in order to let my body recover, or if I can lean into things a little more heavily. But then I also kind of like, sometimes I will have, times where, I'm supposed to be focusing on speed work, but, you've done the workout a bunch of times and it's a little less exciting to kind of really get yourself up and motivated for, another VO2 max style workout. And I'll get a little more creative with it and just kind of do a little more of like a free flowing type workout where you're just injecting like speed intervals into a run in a little less structured manner, or doing like a progression run instead of like a real structured long interval session or tempo session or things like that. So I think like a well executed training plan is probably going to have a balance between the stuff that's like really formal, like 2-to-1 work ratio at 3x10 minutes, or 1-to-1 work ratio at 5x3 minutes and that sort of stuff. But I think if we're honest with ourselves, a lot of times like the little bit of gain that you get from having that really strict structure can get lost and then even surpassed by just like your ability to stay really motivated to do that day in and day out, year after year. So if you're not willing to get at least a little creative with that stuff from time to time, I think you're probably going to sort of miss out on part of the experience, as well as probably part of the actual development that's going to take place when you're really excited to do the workouts you're doing.
Definitely. You could almost see that with younger athletes, guys that were like 17, 18, like crushing it really on the scene, that were pushed really hard by coaches maybe. And then as time went on, their intrinsic motivation just started to peel off, I suppose, because they didn't really have it. They were just kind of naturally talented and they were tested a bit more with it. But I feel like that you kind of do need to have that kind of balance these days, because it's so data driven at sometimes, isn't it? Like whatever sport you're doing, you have that element of it. Do you think that the element that you do have of this, whereby you were measuring like your tempo, measuring your time, measuring your heart rate, allowed you to know that you could go for the big achievements, like the 100-miler? Like that's obviously something that's like fucking mental. But like for yourself, how did you kind of like compartmentalize it in your brain to say that, look, maybe 6 months, maybe 2 years from now, this is something that I'm going to go for, and it's an achievable goal?
Yeah, I think there's a few things that I tend to look for to help determine like where's a reasonable target in terms of like a controllable 100-mile. One of them is like, where is my kind of pace at my aerobic threshold? So like when I look at just most of my data from 100-mile races, it's like, it's not impossible to exceed your aerobic threshold for small like bursts during a 100-miler, but you're burning matches when you're doing that. So you do have to be careful. And my thought is, like, from an efficiency standpoint, especially through fueling, the lower I can get my pace at my aerobic threshold, likely the faster I can probably run 100 miles, or at least the more mistakes I can afford to make while running 100 miles, because I got a little more of a buffer zone between the actual pace I'm targeting and where that ceiling to my aerobic threshold is actually at. I get there through a variety of different kind of like periodized training, but generally speaking, that's kind of like my window into where I'm at, or if I'm on track. And I've done enough of them now where I sort of can kind of lean on prior experience and trends that I saw in my training when I've had well executed races, and ones where I think like I got maybe a little too aggressive for my fitness at the time. And usually there's kind of a dual thing going on where, one, I need to be able to hit the pace at the intensity that I'm trying to, build up towards, but then I have to be able to do it in a longer frame, like a week. I need to be able to hit a certain amount of volume within that too, to know that I'm actually bouncing back from those workouts effectively, so that I know that, like, say at mile 70, the wheels aren't going to fall off because I just, I had the speed, but I didn't have the duration, so to speak.
Yeah, I get you.
Yeah. And there's things I can see in training. Like, so for example, like if I early on, when I'm first starting to develop my back-to-back long runs for a race, I'll often I'll get that second one done and I'll require a rest day the next day. Whereas by the end, I can do those and I get up the next day and I feel like I could probably do it again if I had to, which is a good sign, because on race day, I'm going to have to. And I think there's some signs in the recovery process too that indicate like maybe a little bit more about how sustainable this pace is going to be in the later stages of an ultra marathon. Because it's one thing to be able to just kind of white knuckle your way through a workout and make those numbers look good on paper, but then if on, the next day you're wrecked versus feeling like you did some work but reasonable. I think those are very different kind of positions to be in when it comes to being able to actually sustain that pace for these longer races.
Yeah, it's a difficult one to balance, isn't it? Because like, so for context, like my sport is bodybuilding, and I've competed. I've been pushing myself really hard. When you're on like a gaining phase and the numbers are going up and up and up, it doesn't tell the true story. You can't just like look at numbers on a paper. So I always found it interesting from your work that you were like listening to your body. And like, do you analyze like biofeedback that much? Would you listen to less your stress levels, your energy exertion, your post training feeling? Is there any kind of like mechanical feedback you're taking in just out of, sense, like from your body yourself, that you're taking in?
Yeah, there's a few things that kind of pop up outside of the runs and then during the runs as well that I'm paying attention to. And when I'm kind of really in a really good groove with race specific intensity, it gets to the point where like I can really just zone out. And that's a good sign for me, because I'm going to need to be able to do that on race day. Because if you're constantly kind of focused the way you'd be for like a 5K, 10K, or a marathon, there's only so much of that your mind can kind of tolerate before it just gives in. So you sort of need to be in a position where the pace is sustainable enough where if you just like drift off into like almost like a meditative state, you don't all of a sudden start really slowing down too, or accidentally speeding up and not being able to kind of like just get into cruise control is probably the best way to describe it. So when I hit a phase in the training where I'll go out for a run and I know I'm going to be targeting like around 100-mile intensity, then like if I can go through that run and almost feel like I like was sleeping during it, for lack of a better word, then I know I'm in a great spot, because I'm just able to intuitively dial that effort up and just kind of cruise. Then there's stuff that I'm noticing, like in terms of like course correcting, or is usually where I'll do this, is post workout stuff, where like if I start noticing that like my energy levels are dipping like throughout periods of the day versus being able to kind of sit down and put in like some time recording podcasts and writing coaching plans at a level of energy that I would expect to be able to do minus the training, then I know I'm probably behind on fuel or sleep or rest and recovery and things like that. And it's time to like either take a look at like what's maybe causing that. Am I overreaching in training, or am I just not giving myself enough like downtime to bounce back from this? Am I getting a little behind on fueling and need to like lean into that a little heavier? And there's just a lot of moving parts when you look at a
Of course.
training strategy like mine, where, you know, off season can be very little exercise. Base building is kind of one aspect, and that's going to require a certain amount of energy intake. Short intervals are going to be a little bit different. Your body's going to respond different to those from an energy need standpoint, as well as just kind of how you structure different things. And same thing with long intervals and the long run development. So yeah, you are kind of playing with sort of ballpark numbers to a degree when you start getting into like, oh, I just did back-to-back 30-mile runs. How much food do I need to fuel that?
Mm-hmm.
So you start stringing weeks and weeks of that together, and then you get yourself in a situation where you do have to pay attention to things like that. Like, am I having like dipping energy levels? Am I having a harder time falling asleep at night or staying asleep at night? Things like that I think are little early warning signs that you can pay attention to. And if you adjust when you see those, you can kind of like stay on track a little bit longer than you maybe would be able to otherwise.
Yeah, like I heard you speak about as well about, you know, the intensity you can keep up cannot be maintained forever. Like it's not sustainable to be doing the
Mm-hmm.
super long runs and whatnot. And I see that a lot in bodybuilding too. You see it in every aspect. Like let's say when you're building a business, you can go really hell for leather for a few weeks, and then you'll start getting those biofeedback signals to say that you are fucked. You need to take it easy, small, but you
Yeah.
know. So I often see those areas, and it's very particular in dieting as well. If you reduce your calories so much, the first thing I notice myself is that my sleep will go. It's easier as I can get to the gym earlier in the morning, but I do
Mm-hmm.
realize that I don't wake up at 7:40. I wake up at 7 or 6:40, and it eats in a small bit. Like, have you been measuring your sleep? I see a lot of like high performers recently now, like putting more time into sleep performance using Aura rings and other types of wearables.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the watch that I use by a company called Koros does a lot of sleep metric stuff. They started adding that to their suite of data. So I'll pay attention to a couple things. I think the thing I pay attention to the closest is where my resting heart rate dips to at night. So if it's like, for me historically, like if it's getting down to the low 40s and maybe even peaking into the high 30s at some point during the night, then I'm pretty much ready to go. If it's starting to linger into the like mid to upper 40s, or I have a night where it's like barely dips under 50, that's a good sign. I'm starting to toast myself a bit in training and need to take an easy day or a complete day off and let everything kind of catch up, or pay a little closer to like sleep quality and the amount of time I'm giving myself to sleep and stuff like that. So I'm looking at that, as well as just I'll watch like kind of like deep sleep metrics and things like that, just to kind of tease out, because sometimes it doesn't always make sense either. Like I'll have a night where I didn't feel like I slept as long as I normally would, but the metrics will show that I was spending a lot of time in kind of more of a deep restorative sleep, and I feel great. I'm just like, okay, well, if I would look at this just as like the total number of hours I slept versus the deep sleep, then I would have maybe freaked out about this. But the body does, I think, kind of adjust and tries to accommodate your life a little bit with some of that stuff. So you don't always have 9+ hours to try to sleep at night. And I think like if you can get yourself to sleep and get into like quality sleep, you're probably going to go a long ways with that as well. So I'll watch that. I don't know how many clear trend lines I've seen in terms of like, if my deep sleep is at this number consistently, I can guarantee I'm going to nail this workout, versus if it starts getting like really poor, I start kind of noticing it suffer. Outside of what I could kind of intuitively sense.
Yeah.
Usually I think a lot of the sleep metric stuff end up telling the story your body's telling you anyway. It's just sometimes we need something to slap us in the face and say, hey man, it's clear the data's in, you're doing it wrong, versus,
Yeah.
I'm just going to push through it and ignore the signals my body's giving me.
Yeah, man, it's so funny with that because I don't use that at the moment, and I've been flirting with the idea, and I know people have recommended it to me, and they said it's a lot better. But like me being very type A personality, I would just go super anal on it, and would just be
Yeah.
looking at this, and then you subconsciously see, oh, like it's a 70% and not a 60, not an 80% sleep rate. Therefore, I should feel a little bit more lethargic, and it could be subconscious. So
Mm-hmm.
there is that kind of element to it, and I laugh when you were saying about the resting heart rate, because when Dustin Poirier was preparing for the McGregor fight, apparently his was like ridiculously high the entire
Yeah.
time, because he was just training like 5-6 days a week. And he was joking, saying that like he had never ever got into the stage whereby he was like ready to train ever. His body
Uh-huh.
was technically screwed for like an 8-week camp, but that's what
Mm-hmm.
he had to do, and that's like the sacrifice he makes. And that's why we were saying that it's not always involved. So there is that balance in that, it's a it's a weird thing that we have to go around with it, and that's why I kind of wanted to chat to you about that kind of psychology aspect too, because for you, there's a lot of things that are at play, So I suppose, like, how do you prepare yourself mentally and not just physically when you're going into any type of event, even a 50 miler, not even necessarily a 100 miler?
Yeah, I think like especially when you get into the longer distance stuff where marathon and below, I mean they're very hard events. I still think the marathon is probably the hardest race that you can do just because it's like this perfect and this is going to be somewhat subjective, but it's like this perfect balance of intensity but duration as well, where it's fast
Mhm.
enough that it will be very painful if things go wrong from a calculation standpoint, but it's also long enough if you do make that mistake, you're paying that price for quite a while if you stick it out. But you can also get quite close to race distance in training. And if you're training at like the elite level, you may be doing long runs that are right up next to that distance. And you might have a good chunk of it, like 2/3 plus of that at goal marathon pace. So you can sort of close that gap between what you do and what you don't know, like the uncertainty on race day. That gap can be quite small if you are training for a distance that you can approach in training a little more
Mhm.
realistically. Now you get into 100 miles, there's just no way you're really going to be getting any close to a 100-mile training session minus doing multiple races, which are probably going to come at an opportunity cost from a quality standpoint, and it sort of takes that off the table. So you're essentially extrapolating forward the mental aspect and the physical aspect to some degree of what you're going to be dealing with at the end stages of a 100-miler with a much bigger gap. And for me, what I find works really well for that is once I start getting into like the phase of training where I'm doing the most, when I'm really focusing on specifics, like the race day intensity, the fueling strategy, the hydration strategy, I'm also trying to think as much about the physical and the logistics of that, and as well as I'm trying to add in the mental aspect of that. So that could be something as simple as just, going out for a long run and visualizing what it would be like to be closing that amount of time or distance at the end of the 100-mile race. So as I'm going through that run, I'm just picturing what it would be like to kind of cover that mile 70 to mile 100 section of the course. Or if I want to get really detailed with it, I'll even break the week into something like that, where like every day sort of has a purpose of like, I'm going to just like pretend I'm working through the paces for this section of the race. And there's different times or points in races that tend to be more problematic from a mental standpoint. So those are ones I tend to give a little more attention to in training in terms of like trying to wrap my head around where I want my mind to go in those situations. So like, usually somewhere around like the late 30-mile, early 40-mile distance is a kind of a hurdle mentally to get over, because you've gotten to and exceeded the longest long run you've done in most cases, but there's still a long ways to go.
Mhm.
So you need your mind to go to the reality that even though you're running 100 miles that day, it's a very small percentage of the work that went into getting to that point in the first place. So it's an important point to really trust your training and not kind of concede to the inevitable doubts that are going to kind of creep in around that time or try to tempt you to slow down or kind of give up on your A goal and settle in and that sort of thing. Um, the other spot that kind of always sticks out too is I'm always a little anxious to get to the point where I'm within my longest long run, or at least within like the distance of where the average of my longest long runs kind of landed on the buildup, because then I can really be honest with myself and say like, well, do you have one more long run in your legs? Because if the answer is yes, then you're not running 100 miles anymore that day. Now you're just doing one more long run, and I'll probably have done a dozen of those in the 6 or so weeks leading into my taper. So there's a lot of precedent to reflect back on if you are physically in a good spot to be able to kind of wrap your head around doing one more long run, which just means those long runs need to be used as dress rehearsals to practice the visualization of, say, 70 miles to 100. Because then when you do get there and decide I can do one more, you can kind of put your mind on cruise control in the sense that it knows the paces, it knows what to think about, it knows where to go when the negative stuff creeps in, and how to kind of focus on the positives and the things that are actually going to get you to the finish line in the spot that you want to. Uh, if that sort of makes sense.
Man, it makes perfect sense. I think the visualization element is huge, and that's why I think it's so awesome to like analyze high performers like you, and then other aspects of life, let's say if it's business or whatnot, because like you may not have ever got to, let's say, 100 miles or 120 miles or whatever it is, but you were visualizing that process up beforehand, and you're working through those mental models, and then you can walk into other aspects of your life, and it's transferable. Is like visualization something you'd work on in all aspects of your life, or just within this training compartment?
I definitely do like the same kind of approach with everything, whether it be like podcasting or coaching and things like that, where I am thinking about like, where's the what is the goal with this? And I mean, it doesn't have to be something as like rigid as like performance metrics. It can be just like, there are, I think, there's value in doing things just for the sake of doing them because you enjoy them. And if that's the case, then I think you just got to be honest with yourself about that. But yeah, I think it's, I think basically everything I do with training and structuring that and then racing there's lessons to be learned from that stuff and where you can kind of translate it towards other areas of life and really kind of lean into that. So I would say like how strict I am with like actual formal like meditation and visualization practice and things like that is probably a little less common than it would be if I wasn't running. I think one of the benefits of racing events as long as I do is my peaking weeks and things like that are at a low intensity relative to what a peak week would look like if I were training for like a 5K or 10K and you're doing like VO2 max workouts and things like that as you're prepping for the race. I have a race
You're already
distance.
meditating.
You kind of are
through that process,
and yeah, and that's what makes the 100-mile unique, I think, is it's slow enough where you have that opportunity to do that sort of stuff in training without having kind of that almost sharp ringing in your ear that comes with doing higher intensity stuff. So that's good. But then on race day, you're also left with this situation where like all those thoughts have opportunity to come into your mind. And then you also have the opportunity to think about them, overthink them, second guess yourself, third guess yourself. Whereas like if you're racing something shorter or more intense, it's you kind of make a decision and you go with it because there's just not enough room with that intensity to let a whole lot creep in outside of like whatever your first impulse is to do. So it's sort of just a different approach and they're both hard and have their benefits for different reasons. And I just think thinking of those things is kind of step one to finding the importance in them. And then learning how to kind of embed that sort of visualization stuff into things that you're already doing is just a great time hack for busy people too. Cause like at the end of the day, there is only 24 hours and you have to be able to use your time wisely. So if I'm out for like a 2-hour run in the morning, I'm thinking like, well, what else can I be doing during this, whether it's with my mind or whether it's learning something from a podcast or whatever it happens to be to maximize that versus just get one thing out of it.
It's the element of like high achievers being able to do multiple different things, and that's why you see so much people being successful in different domains. They may not come from an ultra background, but it's having an ultra approach towards life is how I should describe it. So I feel like for you, subconsciously, let's say you were looking at, let's say, even starting your coaching business around it and thinking in your head, well, I've done all the hard stuff, done all the running. I can definitely tackle this, and that's how I feel a lot of times with people, even myself. Like you build a podcast, you build this. Is well, if I build this, I can probably build something else or have a crack off it, So, and I know you spoke as well on other podcasts around like, your friends are like ultra guys and they're like, they have normalized running 50 to 100 miles. Whereas like on the outside, that's not normal. But when you take that example and bring it into, let's say, like a business sense or a life sense, if you're surrounded by those individuals psychologically, that just becomes a new baseline, doesn't it? So like when you're struggling through these different areas, you look around at some of your mates who are killing it. And now for you, that's your new baseline.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, you definitely normalize things that would otherwise be kind of absurd if you were on the outside looking in. I mean, even for myself, I remember when I was in college and I met with my college cross country and track coach for the first time just to see if it was even something that would be feasible to do. And he just basically broke down, and I'm pretty sure he probably did this with everyone who was interested. So he kind of got an idea of like, this is what it entails. So be honest with yourself if you're going to put this work in or not. And like he just spelled out kind of what the training trajectory was for like the freshmen through their senior year. And I remember thinking about just the expectations for the juniors and seniors, thinking like, I don't think I'll ever run that much in a week. And that was the first thought that crossed my mind when I heard him kind of break it all down. And then, thankfully I didn't like take that first initial assumption too seriously because now I'm running further than that in a day sometimes. But like, but yeah, it is all relative to where you're at the moment, and then how much time you're going to give it to kind of normalize in a lot of these things, especially I think with endurance running or anything that takes months and years to really kind of get to a point where the development has time to occur to the point where you're hitting personal bests and getting close to your full potential. You're just going to have to be patient and kind of take your growth like one step at a time versus trying to be at the finish line, right when you get started.
Do you think that expectation was one of the reasons why you became successful, is the fact that you didn't walk into it with expectations? You didn't walk into it going to smash a marathon, didn't go into it going to build a super big business. You came into it being like, this looks fucking tough, but I'm going to do it because it sounds interesting and it excites me in some sort of way.
Yeah. And I mean, running has been a hobby for a longer time of my life than it has been a profession. So that's helpful, I think, in the sense that there was never a pressure or an expectation on me to like overly emphasize running as something that is going to be a big like mover in my life. It was always a choice, up until I decided to make, and I decided to make it a career too. So it was like, I had when I first started running, it was like my parents, they were excited about like the success I would have. And they were definitely open to like giving me opportunities to explore it, but they weren't necessarily going to say like, oh, well, quit all the other sports and, don't go hang out with your friends on the weekend. You should be, getting to bed early and waking up and doing some training Saturday morning. It was like, that was never even anything like hinted at. So like my high school experience was very much just kind of doing it for fun and finding successes where they were at. And then college, I got a little more structured with it, but it was still a choice. I wasn't, winning national championships or even being the top of my college team or anything like that. So I think that was helpful not to have like the incentive to say put track and cross country ahead of education at the time, because there wasn't any signals at that point in my life that would be a career path that was going to be, worth my efforts. It wasn't until after college where I got into ultra running, and then some of it was just timing. I was fortunate that when I got into ultra running, it was about to make another big growth spurt, and it seems like it just makes another growth spurt every year. And I've been able to stay in the sport long enough now where, you build a bit of a brand or a business around what you're doing, and you can have a situation where you're a professional athlete. And, if you're someone like myself who doesn't necessarily want to just train and race, you can build a lot of other stuff around that, like a coaching business, podcasting, and engaging with people on social media and things like that. So I always think that kind of having that slow introduction and having these presented to me kind of like a little more gradually was useful, because by the time I was in a position to actually take it as a career, I was old enough to kind of know what that meant and know what has to come along for the ride with a professional athlete's career, where, from a performance standpoint, it's going to be a short career, no matter how you look at it, comparatively to what I could do if I were just going to start a business or continue teaching, which is what my original profession was. You can do that for decades and decades if you want to or need to. Whereas training professionally, it's like, if you get a solid decade out of that, you're probably above average from a timeline standpoint.
Yeah, like it's interesting because I suppose people have short-term thinking versus long-term thinking. But for yourself, are you able to extrapolate that and think, okay, well, long term, this is what I can do? And I think as well, like, you don't give yourself enough credit. Like, you are a very good marketer at heart. I think you are able to tell your story really well and able to get yourself across really well. And that's a unique position to be in. It's an art, it's a story. It comes from your own podcast as well. And I think you're able to kind of tell that kind of narrative and build your brand around it, which is really good. What have been some of your kind of like influences? Like, let's say, even not necessarily when you were younger or even when you're younger, like, who were the biggest kind of influences if your parents weren't pushing, let's say, that hard, or your early like coaches or whatnot? How did that kind of come about?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think I've had a lot of influences that are just like, like either people or like things that I saw that were kind of like motivating to me. I think just like anybody else. So you get like, the stories that are motivating that pop up, and that kind of excites you to say, okay, I'm going to take this a little bit more seriously. And, they probably came in at the right time, where we're like, independent of running too. So it wasn't always like something like where it was some professional runner or someone doing what it was I envisioned I'd be doing someday that really motivated me. It was more just like kind of the practice of, taking something seriously enough or caring about something enough where you were willing to do some of the things that maybe most people wouldn't in order to kind of find that limit or find where that was. And I couldn't tell you, I'm not sure where the drive is to like kind of test myself physically, like where that maybe got first, if that's something that was just like that I was going to find no matter what, or if it was something that was really impressed upon me by like somebody or a variety of people over time. But I do think that is a big piece of that puzzle, is like this desire to like, when you start something to really figure out like, where that will lead if you give it the attention it deserves. And that sort of guided me through the majority of my career so far.
Yeah, it's a attention it deserves, isn't it? As in, like, not looking at something in a vacuum, thinking, "Oh, this is a good opportunity," or "This could be," someone might think something of me for doing this. It's about like looking at how much work is involved, putting the time into it, and then seeing it. It's interesting you say about other people as well, and I wanted to ask you about. I'm gonna fuck up his name, Aleksandr Sorokin, and his
Yeah.
new
Sorokin.
his latest record. So for anyone who doesn't know, he ran 198 miles and 319 kilometers in 24 hours. So, like, what's your thoughts on that? That was most recent. Was that in September?
Yeah, that was about a month ago, I think. So yeah, it's pretty
22nd,
recent.
I thought. September.
Yeah. Yeah, that's just kind of like the tip of the tip of the iceberg, so to speak, with Sorokin. He's been on a tear the last like year
Yeah.
or two, essentially. And I mean, he's just an interesting story altogether, I think, like where he's been in the sport for a while, actually, but a little bit more kind of like 1 foot in, 1 foot out, maybe you describe it. Um, and I mean, he's had some successes before these last couple of years. He had won the Spartathlon at a fairly fast time, all things considered. But really, with the type of stuff that he's doing, he's really into like the timed event stuff, essentially from 6 hours up to 24 hours so far. So like before his most recent like assault on the record book, so to speak, there was Giannis Kyrgios was the guy who held most of those records up until recently. And a lot of people consider those records unbreakable or very tough to exceed. And they stood out a lot of times too, because if you look at like Kyrgios's Spartathlon record, which is a race in Greece that's 153 miles, and it's just kind of like an older historic one that is a pretty big measuring stick for a lot of people who do like kind of the longer timed event stuff or the flatter running stuff. And he's like a couple hours ahead of everyone on that course record. Before Sorokin, he was quite a bit ahead of everyone in the 24-hour as well. So he's just been, he had an opportunity during the pandemic to take running a little more seriously or kind of channel his primary focus into that. And he took that opportunity and ran with it, literally ran with it.
Literally.
Yeah. To the point where like he broke the 100-kilometer world record, the 100-mile world record, 12-hour world record, 6-hour world record, 24-hour world record, and a few of those on more than one occasion. So,
what the fuck?
Yeah, so he found something that's working for him, and has definitely put the time and attention towards that, and made that such a big priority that he's able to kind of, make sure that he's getting everything out of it. So it's interesting to kind of talk to him and hear his story and things like that too. And I mean, on top of it too, he was like, before he got into running, he was like a professional, like canoe kayaker, like for a while when he was younger, then stopped that altogether and gained a bunch of weight. So he got way overweight, was drinking, smoking, like the typical, like, kind of screw it mentality, I guess, to health and fitness. And then kind of saw that wasn't going to be a very good outcome and started running. And once he started running, he started just entering races and things like that. And one thing led to another. And then now he's running ultra marathons at a world-class level and breaking a lot of those. So who knows how far he'll go? Like you see like the course he ran 198 miles on is not the fastest course you can do that on. It was championship settings. So championship settings are typically not designed for running world records or even personal bests. And I think, and his pacing strategy, he's had a really, really good pacing strategy or structure so far up until that last 24 hour, where like you'd look at just kind of how his splits played out from the beginning to the end, and you'd see like maybe a small positive split at the end, but pretty tight for the most part, what I would expect to see in like a world record performance for the most part. Whereas this most recent one, he went out like blazing fast and ended up running quite a bit slower from a pacing standpoint in the back end than he did relative to the front half, comparatively to what you normally see. Now, it produced a world record, but it tells me if he paces himself more similar to some of his other ones, he may go another like 8-10 miles further than he did on that day. And I don't, people are like super fixated on that 200-mile number for obvious reasons. It's a nice, clean, like benchmark that I think most people before Sorokin thought was probably unachievable. He's going to go well past 200 if he has a race like he did most recently on a faster course with a little bit of a different pacing strategy. So it'll be interesting to see what he does and kind of how that really motivates other people to kind of reach past what they previously thought were unachievable. Because there's a couple guys that are sort of in his shadow right now who are putting up big numbers in the 24-hour timed event that if it weren't for Sorokin, people would be looking at them like, this is the next Giannis Kuros kind of a mentality. And you get a little bit of that, I think, anytime you have someone kind of break through a ceiling that was there before.
Yeah. Isn't that funny that like you always have like one big dog who's like dominating like the newspapers and the articles and whatnot, but then there's a couple people that are trailing behind. Wasn't it like during Usain Bolt's like reign, Johan Blake was like just behind him, but Johan Blake was like also breaking these records. But he didn't get like any, like, of course within the athletic sphere he was getting recognition, but like who
not
the
a
fuck knows
household
Johan
name
Blake?
because of it.
Exactly. You know what I mean? Very few people. So your estimation is that like many people will pass the 200-mile mark, and you think that will even happen maybe this year?
Yeah, I don't know about many people. I think Sorokin for sure has shown that he can. The interesting thing about the flat runnable stuff right now is we've had a shift to some degree with shoe technology in the last about 5-6 years. So what used to be the fastest shoe choice you could kind of select was fairly hard to reach for most ultra runners because it is essentially as low profile as you could get. And that can be problematic for longer races because you're just asking a lot from your lower leg muscles in that case. And, you're extrapolating things out where like you might hit a margin of diminishing returns there, where now all of a sudden the fastest shoe on paper isn't, because the distance is so long, it's no longer an option. Whereas around 2015, 2016, Nike came out with this midsole technology that now returns a higher percentage of energy than even like a racing flat would have in the past. So we're seeing like efficiency standards improve by like, approximately 4% with the shoe technology. And, we're seeing that play out across the board in road running. So a lot of the records we're seeing are done in these shoes. And part of it is progress in the sport, but part of it's also, if you're a marathoner and you have a pair of shoes that allows you to run 3-4 minutes faster, when you're at the elite end, 3 or 4 minutes is the difference between being 2 minutes off of a world record and 2 minutes ahead of it. So I think it's kind of changed the sport to a degree similar to like when bikes kind of switched to carbon frames. You saw a lot of that technology really kind of like rocketed the performances out. So I think like in terms of measuring performances from like the 80s, 90s, and some of the old records and things like that with some of them today, it gets a little more messy with that because you stretch that performance metric out to 24 hours. Now you might be looking at like 8, 9, 10 miles versus like, a handful of minutes. And the interesting thing about Sorokin is like, he's not just breaking some of these records. He's going well past them to the point where even with a very like aggressive prediction and how much the shoes are making a difference, he's still at or slightly past a lot of the records he's broke. And then if he goes out and runs a 208-mile 24-hour or something like that, now he's, even with the shoes, he's looking at like you could take the shoes out and put a traditional pair of sneakers on him, and if he does 208 in a pair of super shoes, he's probably still doing 200 in a pair of typical like running shoes. So it's like the numbers are off the charts regardless of whether you put that for him. Now, for someone else who's like, was someone in like the maybe mid to high 170s as their peak potential, Now they maybe are getting into the mid 180s. So there could be some of that happening with some of these guys who are like right around where the previous records were, but not quite past them, and just like a good margin behind Sorokin. But we'll see where they end up too. You know, they have a career ahead of them too. They could easily put up bigger numbers than they have to date, and then they could be in that same position where you could say, hey, even without the shoes, they're running as far as Giannis Kouros was back when he was dominating the sport.
I love that challenger mindset because, like, you know, as you said, 10 years ago, it was impossible, impossible in quotation marks. 30 years ago, you know, running a sub 10-second 100-meter was also impossible, you know? So it's like we're always testing it. It's just like human nature of like wanting to just be better and just, you know, I don't know, just improve in different aspects. What I wanted to ask you on this was like, is there regular drug testing in endurance running? How does that work?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big problem. Big problem even at the Olympic distance, where they have about as good a drug testing as you could expect a sport of that kind of magnitude to have. Ultra running is really underserved with that, and part of it is just like the lack of funding, because I mean, you have a situation where the sport's grown now to the point where we can and should expect better drug testing than we currently have. But even if it was up to par with what we're seeing at like Olympic distance stuff, chances are it wouldn't be good enough yet to be like kind of bulletproof. And that's kind of a reality, I think, with sports in general. Is just like, you know, there's the protocols for cheating are in a lot of cases going to be a step ahead of the testing. So it's always kind of playing catch up a little bit on that end of things. Ultra running, the most you're going to probably see is post competition testing, and a lot of that is going to only be done in events that are either really, really big name trail events or USATF or World Athletic Championship level races. So like if you break a world record or a national record, chances are you're going to get drug tested after that. But if you go and you run just like a relatively big trail race that, you know, you can jumpstart a career off of, chances are you're not going to get drug tested after that. Like I think there's maybe only a couple high profile trail races that do any meaningful testing before or after it. And there's very little testing out of competition, which is where you really need it to be, because there's just there's so many shortcuts that you can take and then, you know, stop at the right time and then find yourself like passing. I mean, we saw that with Lance Armstrong, obviously, and that whole, like, I mean, he's the kind of the target for that comparison. But I mean, that sort of an approach is available. I think with ultra running, you know, in terms of having like the super sophisticated stuff where that you saw with some of the documentaries around like the Tour de France and things, where you have like a team of doctors and like vans driving around with blood infusions and stuff like that. I mean, you're going to have some heavy hitter stuff getting done in ultra running, but probably not nearly to the caliber of like Tour de France at this point. But still things that will definitely move the needle. And we have had people get caught too, even without like great testing. So if people are getting caught when it's like basically you got caught because you had something in your system that we tested for after this event, you know, they made some mistakes in terms of how they kind of executed that process. And the only thing I think that really kind of can correct past transgressions, if you want to say that, would be like some sort of like a bank of tests that can detect things that we can't now that would be able to down the road. And we see some of that when they go back and retest samples and stuff like that. So
yeah, that's the Olympic approach, isn't it? Really, like you could find like the 2004 Olympian in like the bar gymnastics gets caught. You know, that's just like the reality. So it's just that there's this, you know, even as we discussed the last 45 minutes, there's so many variables at play that when you add in performance enhancing drugs over the course of 365 days, there's so many ways for people to get around it, you know, just like naturally. So like you need such a tight lens really with this, because it's all baked in, you know. If someone knows they're running, and not necessarily even running, if it's bodybuilding, they do natural shows or whatever, if they know it's 18 months away, they know how to schedule it. And it may come up, whatever, but I suppose it's the reality of sport. But it would just be a shame to see like negative things happen, like the Lance Armstrong scenario,
Hmm.
because I suppose that changes people's psychology around the sport. And I suppose where I like seeing what I love about ultras the most is that it's just raw endurance of the mind and of the body, and I'd like to see that caliber maintained.
Hmm. The nice thing in ultra running is there definitely is a culture around anti-doping. So you didn't
Mm,
have that with like cycling. In cycling, in fact, the culture was get on the program or go back home. So
mm,
I mean, that's an advantage that ultra running has, is that it did kind of come up after triathlon in popularity and after road cycling. So there wasn't necessarily this kind of built-in system of doping the way there was in those sports. That's not to say that if an individual wants to kind of skirt the rules, they can't find a way to do it. That's probably the case when these people get caught, is they decided, hey, this is an opportunity for me to take advantage of the system and I'm going to do it, versus them coming in and feeling like they're left with this moral dilemma of, do I get on board with all my competitors or do I just go a different career path, which is what I think we saw in cycling and how that got as bad as it got.
mm.
Um, but I think you can only rely on the community and the peer pressure side of things to so much degree, because there's always going to be a percentage of the population that doesn't care about that and they're willing to take the moral step outside the morals of the average person in the community and do the things that we're hoping everyone avoids on the just on honesty. And you need to have testing and things that are in place to kind of catch those situations, I guess.
Definitely, and it's a community driven thing for sure. Like you don't see it as much in, let's say, like soccer or whatnot, because of the fact that it's part of the culture, which is really good. I wanted to ask you and dig into the nutrition side of things. So I would not think that an ultra marathon runner who runs so far would be on a low carb diet. Just like logically, just society, the way society is like positioned, I would not think that that's the case. Even when I was running marathons during COVID, I was doing like 30 kilometers, like 20 kilometers, 30 kilometers, 40 kilometers. I was always on a high carb diet, but I used to run, would you believe, fasted in the morning. I know you spoke about running fasted as well. So that was
Mhm.
kind of a flip side of things. Why do you think, a low carb diet or a keto diet is very advantageous for even yourself for endurance running?
Yeah, I think when you get into ultra marathons, you have to sort of you've got to step away from just like endurance in general, because this is like, think where a lot of the arguments end up happening with this stuff is people want to look at endurance athletes as this like monolith, as like, if they run a fast 5K, they must run a fast 100 mile and vice versa, or what you do to run a fast 5K is going to be perfectly translatable to what you would do from a fueling standpoint and an energy demand standpoint for a 100 mile. And then if you want to unpack it even further, we're looking at different people, different goals, different populations. It's like if we want to look at just elite Olympic caliber athletes versus somebody finishing in the middle of the back of the pack that has like a lot of other life expectations and priorities and things like that, we're dealing with very different variables in terms of how those are going to weigh on their finishing time. So I think like when you start getting into like races like 100 mile distance, I think low carb becomes a bit more of a even playing field for some people, because race day intensity is just going to be lower, and there's a huge variable of fueling during a race like 100 miles that is not going to be present in some of these shorter like track races and things like that. So if you get a situation where like input is needed of this caliber for muscle glycogen defense, but the person's not able to do that digestively, then they're gonna have to find a way in order to balance that out. And one way to do that is going to be through dietary manipulation by increasing their fat oxidation rates. And it's not an end all be all thing too. You can improve your fat oxidation rates by just repositioning carbohydrates, or by, like you said, doing fasted long runs. You can improve fat oxidation rates just purely through training too. These are all like levers that kind of are included and should be considered when someone's deciding whether they want to kind of go down a low carbohydrate path or lean into moderate high carbohydrate and all this stuff. So when I'm working with people on it, where I'm asking these questions, we're trying to figure out what the practicalities, like what their options actually include, And then it comes down to just like practicality of just like what is required to fuel a high carbohydrate diet on race day. And that's going to likely require a lot of like gut training type techniques and things like that, where you are going to be eating a lot of refined type products to kind of prepare your body to be able to use that. And, then you have to look at the population too. If this is a person who's doing an ultra marathon for like, for fun and quote unquote fun, but also has like a bunch of other objectives from health and things like that. And they don't want to be trying to mainline upwards to 90 grams of carbohydrate per hour on training runs. It's like, some people just don't want to do that too. So like you have to be practical about what the expectations are for a moderate and high carbohydrate approach, as well as the expectations for a low carbohydrate or ketogenic approach. I think what ends up happening is like people are really willing to step outside population level data and what we know versus what we don't know, and start working with people at the individual level, which is what I typically like to do. Especially when I'm working with a client one-on-one, that's exactly what we're going to do. And the hard part, I think, is you start to get kind of a little bit of, and people like to label things because it's easy and convenient for them to categorize and keep track of things. So I don't blame them for that. But then like you get people will look at me as like the low carb keto guy because I do that. But when I look at like my roster of coaching clients, it's like, typically over half of them are following some sort of moderate to high carbohydrate diet. And one of the reasons for that is because it was working for them, so it's like, I'm not going to necessarily try to break something that's not broken, or, shift my approach towards someone else when it's not something that's necessarily showing the same signs it did for me when I made the switch and it worked well for me. And then if there is someone who's doing well, but is curious about it and that they express that interest, then, I work with them and trying to implement the strategy. And then we just pay very close attention to kind of how their performance is and whether things are showing up the way we want them to in training and the rest of their life. And if it is, great. If not, we can always pivot back to what they were doing before.
Yeah. One thing on that, sorry, is that I think it's interesting to hear you take that kind of anecdotal approach, because like for me, like even as a bodybuilder, I'd be on high carbs at the moment, so like up to around 450 to 500 grams a day, which is a lot. And you said there about digestion, so I did have digestion issues, but my body has adapted to that high level. But it's funny because on the flip side, which I heard you speak about as well, about when you have more of so I do have a high protein diet, 250 260 grams a day, bear in mind, and I'm only 180 pound myself, so that's a high amount of protein. So but when I went carnivore at the stage where actually when you were on Joe Rogan, I remember I had extremely bad digestion issues, like really bad constipation. Like but it was, I did 4 weeks of it. But this is the way it's really interesting, right? Because I could see why that was advantageous for people like Lex, for people like maybe like yourself, whatever. But for myself, then that's like fast twitch muscle fibers for explosive bodybuilding training. I had like very low pump, I had very low energy levels, I had very bad digestion. But I really wanted to follow that diet. But isn't that strange? Is that it's always individual. It's not like you can't take the sample size of 1,000 or 10,000.
Yeah, every time I think I found something that's a universal truth, there's always someone who kind of defies that. I mean, I see that on both sides of like the ketogenic low carb stuff too, where I'll have a coaching client who I get such a mix of people, because people do recognize me as someone who's coaching and has like some experience with that approach. So I think a lot of times if someone is already following a low carb keto diet and they're looking for a coach, my name probably comes up in some capacity. And if they decide they want to work with me for the whole approach, then I have just as many clients where it's like they are pretty strict keto, like sometimes like 30 grams of carbohydrates or less, and we're going to implement a training approach. And I'm I'll tell them up front, I'll say most of my coaching clients that are low carb don't stay that low. It's like, there's parts of the year where they can maybe sustain that, but from a performance standpoint, we're usually going to see a better outcome if you're able to increase your carbohydrates a little bit during these certain phases at least, and cluster them around some of the more intense sessions and things like that. And more often than not, they're bringing their carbohydrates up a little closer, say 100 to 150 grams per day. and maybe like going past that, but borrowing from a different day, if you want to look at it that way, in order to kind of keep those higher intensity days a little more carbohydrate fueled, and then those easy rest days a little more kind of ketogenic low.
But what about if they're going in and out then of ketosis? No, or would that be happening? So like, would they go out of it by going up to 150?
Yeah, almost certainly. I think it's like, the interesting thing is the big variable there is their lifestyle. So their training lifestyle is going to be like a huge determiner on kind of where they fall on average with that. So the way I like to describe it is, if I decided just to start eating moderate to high carbohydrate for like, a couple months, and then decided, okay, switch directions, strict keto, but remove all the exercise, I'm just living a relatively sedentary life. It's going to take me probably 2 to 3 days to get to a point where I'm producing like a meaningful amount of blood ketones. Now, I could do, and I'm going to be strict, probably like under 50 grams, if not lower. Now you introduce a scenario where like I'm training the way I am, peaking for a 100-mile race. I've done testing, like blood testing, ketone testing, during like a 3-week stretch of this training, where there are days where I'm pushing up sometimes even close to 300 grams of carbohydrate, which would be a lot for someone who's sedentary. But when you put like a 4,000 to 5,000 calorie demand onto that, it's not quite as egregious as it looks like from a ratio standpoint. But I'm probably popping out of ketosis for a little bit around some of those meals. But if I test myself like that next morning after my run or something like that, I'm right back there. So I don't think there's necessarily, people get fixated on like blood ketone levels and like whether they should be in ketosis or out of ketosis. I don't think that's like overly important, to be honest, from a performance standpoint. I think it's more about like where your fat oxidation rates, which are going to correlate to some degree. But, even with that, like I've done lab testing where my blood ketones are just barely in range for what would be considered like ketosis. So like 0.6 millimoles or something like that. But when I get my fat oxidation rates tested, I'm still like way above what would have been considered like, high end of the charts prior, when we're testing people on a moderate to high carbohydrate diet. So I think you kind of need to look at it like a more of a spectrum than you do in an all or nothing thing, where there is a spectrum from zero carb up to basically as much carb as you can get away with without having, like problems with not enough fat or not enough protein. And then everywhere in between those are going to be different points that may match what you're trying to do well. So then it comes down to the individual. It comes down to what they're training for and what their lifestyle looks like, to really determine what it's gonna play out like. And the way I tend to look at that is like, if I were to decide to just change directions altogether and start focusing on like Olympic distance events, I would have to change my diet, like if I wanted to reach my full potential anyway. So I think that's like, people don't usually want to get that granular, because they want to have whatever their approach is be the one that wins at the end of the day, versus actually thinking about it in a sense of like, who cares if 10% of the population is going to benefit from this and 90% is going to benefit from that? We just need to identify who's there and then go with that, versus kind of trying to put these blanket recommendations on people. And I think the blanket recommendations aren't all bad either. I think they're great starting points. And I tend to look at it that way when I'm working with someone. I think the reality is most people are going to be on a moderate to high carbohydrate diet, especially in the endurance world. So what I think we should do with that is like look at where their relative success is with that before changing anything. And if it's not a problem, I don't see a big reason to be like I said, like be like kind of dogmatic about them switching it, versus the person who has had trouble with that approach, has reason to change, and then is curious enough to want to make that a priority. So that's kind of
it's interesting, man. No, you're dead right, because like even like, so in a bodybuilding sphere, like I have a coach that literally is very similar to yourself, would say, okay, like, well, you can progress this much by doing what you're doing right now. But if you want to go to here, you're going to need to change your diet. It always involves a diet change. The training that the training is a training, but it always involves a diet change, and basic things like eating before the gym or whatnot, situating those meals around like the best times to be doing it. Not necessarily the most like optimal, but like for your body type to actually improve it, which I think is an interesting kind of like take, especially with your approach. You mentioned there about your like your digestion though. So do you get much digestion issues off a high fat diet? Like how much grams of fat would you take in a day approximately?
Yeah, I don't get digestion issues from fat. I think like that I'm aware of anyway. Like it's it, for the digestive issues that I'm referring to are more like intra race or intra workout type stuff. So that's where people run into problems in ultra marathoning and like triathlon and things like that, where you have this recommendation of moderate to high carbohydrate at the population level, but you also have like a 50 to sometimes 60% gastrointestinal issues that are reported during these single day ultra marathons. And of that 50 to 60%, about half of those are relatively severe to the point where it's impacting their forward progress. So it's like, those are the digestive issues that I'm like kind of concerned with, because those are the ones that are going to like make or break your race result, versus like something where like someone switches to a carnivore diet and they have like explosive diarrhea for the first couple weeks or whatever it happens to be, because you hear those stories too. And
That was me, man.
yeah. And it's I think you get that with, and I think most of that, a lot of that stuff, whether it be like a certain like plant product that gives people digestive issues, I think a lot of that can probably be adapted to, given enough time and proper preparation and slowly introducing it, versus just going like, I think people are just kind of like a little more like all or nothing, where they're like, oh, spinach is good. Well, I'm going to have a 3-pound spinach smoothie. It's like, well, yeah, you're going to blow your colon up doing that. But if you just had like a handful of spinach, you probably would have been fine. That sort of mentality, I think, ends up creating a lot of these problems. But like digestively for me, like I've always found that it's probably partly due to my high energy output relative to my, essentially like I end up eating 2+ times as much as what my body size would indicate due to activity level. So like you end up with a situation where like the amount of volume of food I have to put in for my size is extreme. And that a lot of times means lower, like higher calorie, low density foods really work well for me, because I don't feel like I'm stuffed all the time. And that's where fat, I think, has really been a valuable tool for me, is I can get a lot of calories in quickly without the big, the feeling of being kind of like stuffed or bloated from it. So in terms of grams per day, it's going to be super dependent on kind of what I'm doing. I'm usually going to be like at least 50% up to around maybe 70% at its highest of my intake coming from fat on any given day. And then those numbers, I like to talk in percentages with this, just because my energy intake demands are so much different from like one day to the next, whether I'm doing a rest day or a high training day. So that people are a little.
How much calories is that? Like, let's say compared to each one.
Yeah, if I'm doing like if I'm doing like back-to-back long runs and developing that side of my training, I'm easily hitting 4,000 to 5,000 calories a day. If I'm in
How are you
off season,
consuming that? Just mainly the bars, the heavy hitting bars.
what was that?
How are you consuming that?
Oh, like that amount of calories.
Yeah, 5,000. Let's say. How would you hit 5,000 a day? That you're training as well.
Oh, gotcha. Yeah. So I'll be doing, when I'm up that high, I'm doing a lot of things like oils, nut butters, fattier cuts of meats. I use this product called S Fuels Train. That's essentially like a powder like you get with like a sports drink, but it's fat based. So I'll be doing a lot more liquid calories, do stuff like that. Some heavy whipping creams and things like that. Like basically, like when I start getting into those numbers, it's like, how can I get 1,000 to sometimes even 2,000 calories calories per day from liquid or close to liquid, like oil-based type stuff, so that it's not like creating like a huge amount of extra volume, or the things that are easy enough to add to what I'm already doing without having it look as noticeable from a volume standpoint, if that sort of makes sense. And then it's really about just kind of balancing out how much carbohydrate I need, because really, if I make a mistake on the fat intake from one day to the next, it only becomes problematic if I continue down that path for too long and I start losing more weight than I would ever intend to. So when I actually look at fat intake, I'm more looking at like a multi-day level. So let's say I have like 2 back-to-back long runs. Chances are I'm either going to have like a rest day or a very easy running day on that third day. So rather than trying to always hit like 5,000 calories for those 2 long run days that I'm actually going to probably exert that much energy, I'm going to probably fall short on those 2 days, but then on that rest day, I'm going to exceed. So maybe I go into that rest day with 1,000 calorie deficit from those 2 long run days. Well, I'm just going to exceed my needs for that rest day by eating that much well and above. So then over that 3-day course, I'm at neutral versus deficit, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. It's interesting to see like how your actual food choices will change as well.
Mm-hmm.
Because you're trying to get things that are like not as much volume,
Mm-hmm.
But it's weird. How do you find your recovery in terms of, let's say, like that well, maybe red meat, fattier meat versus like clean, like something like chicken breast, or do you still consume a chicken breast, or do you not?
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm not like, I wouldn't consider myself carnivore. Like I think people like think that from time to time just because like I was doing like I would have considered myself carnivore for like 2019 and part of 2020, but that was more like the way I describe it is I know what macronutrient ratios I want to hit during different phases of training. And when I was doing like a more carnivore approach, I was still hitting those macronutrient ratios. I was just finding the fats and proteins mostly from animal products versus like having like plant products included with that. So like I've never done any strict carnivore for like longer than like a 2-week stretch in an off season just to kind of see what it was like. Even when I was doing like primarily animal products during 2019, 2020, it was like, there was still, a percentage of that coming from carbohydrates and plants products. And then I've also done the other end of the spectrum where I'm like mostly plant-based and very little amounts of meats or animal products, but still, those same macronutrient products. So like usually I fall somewhere kind of in the middle when I'm not like getting interested or curious about something like that. And that usually determines like what is going to make up a lot of that stuff, or those sort of the macronutrient ratios I'm trying to hit will be determined sometimes on, or what makes up those will determine on kind of where my focus is at the time. But usually I'm a little more kind of like open-ended, of like less about like, well, this is bad and this is good, therefore I should lean into this and not that, and more of just like which one of these is going to fit within that macronutrient target, and then how does it typically affect me. So from like a recovery standpoint, I don't know that I would say that I noticed anything like exceptionally better from the carnivore or the higher animal product versus the lower animal product side of things. I did notice it was a lot easier for me because for those reasons we talked about. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, it's just easy to have like a 3,000 calorie meal if it's like a really fatty ribeye, and that doesn't really sit in my stomach that awkwardly. Versus like if I'm gonna eat 3,000 calories of mostly plant-based products, like that's gonna sit in my stomach a different type of way. So I find digestively having more animal products was like a better experience for me. Now, with that being said, I think there's probably like a path forward within like a lower animal product, high fat approach that would give me a similar experience if I'm just really diligent about getting like, a lot of those calories from like extra virgin olive oil or something like that. That's gonna have a similar kind of sit in your stomach type of feel as the other stuff would be. But yeah, so I think like, for me, it's like kind of trying to make sure I'm hitting the protein targets is a big one.
Yeah,
I'm usually
of
trying to
course.
hit about a gram per pound of body weight is usually where I'm typically going to land.
That's
And
pretty low as well for you. It'd be like 150.
yeah, it's around 150. When I
Yeah.
was doing carnivore or like more animal product stuff, I was probably more routinely going above that just because it's really hard to like not, unless you're just like cooking your meat in like tons of like butter and ghee and
Yeah,
lard and that
that
sort of
that
stuff.
makes no sense. Like 140 grams of protein, but 4,000 calories that day would be very difficult to get in on just a carnivore diet. Like the actual food selection, I suppose.
Yeah.
Because even for me, like as in when I was carnivore, I was eating like pork chops, sirloin steak, stuff like this,
Mhm.
and I was getting up to like 300 grams a day, man. Honestly,
Yeah. And when I was doing more like I'd
I
have
fucked it up. I fucked it up.
yeah, so I think that's probably where one of the possible like biggest downsides would be from someone who's going to try to be really strict with like an animal-based product diet would be you have this scenario where so much protein comes along for the ride. If you're doing something like I am, where you're asking for a huge energy output, you don't necessarily want to be metabolizing a lot of protein for that energy source. So like, I mean, it's just super inconvenient from like a step process standpoint. So, you know, if I end up eating 300 grams of protein because it's coming along for the ride with all the animal products I'm having, then that could be problematic versus having that extra 150 calories that I would normally be getting from, say, fats and carbohydrates. That is going to just be a little quicker, a little bit easier for my body to probably break down or preferably used as fuel, I guess is maybe the way to say it, versus demand driven. So yeah, I think that's where I usually end up kind of falling, is like what's going to end up being like the most practical thing that I can easily stick to without giving it too much thought from one day to the next, once I kind of figure out what's going to work, so I don't waste too much time like calculating and and I go through different
100%.
phases of curiosity. I mean, like curiosity is usually what drives me making any sort of change to what I'm doing from a type of food within this structure standpoint.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And I think I even learned a lot about just from that in terms of like your actual selection of food, how that impacts overall, and how that impacts the overall macronutrient profile. You know, understanding that area. Zach, I want to finish up at this point, and I want to say a massive thank you, man. Where can people check out your stuff, your coaching, everything?
Yeah, first, thanks a bunch for having me on. This has been a fun conversation.
Appreciate it,
Yeah,
man.
people can find me at zachbitter.com, ZACHBITTER.com. And that has links to everything, whether it's my social media stuff, my podcast, coaching services, everything can kind of be funneled through there. From social media standpoint, I'm most active on Instagram, which is just at ZachBitter, and then Twitter, which is at ZBitter.
Awesome, man. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.